Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime, and I am your host as always, Professor Prime. And we're going to talk about math in comics. 5. Yes, 5. Because there's so much to be said as far as comics are concerned, and so much to be said as far as math is concerned, and a lot to be said with the math in comics. And today we're going to focus on graphic novels, books, and adaptations. So let's get into it. And throughout this video, we're going to talk about how math is used in comics in general, and then use that to talk about like the different topics that I just mentioned. So to start, when I think comic books, I think a lot of things. I think about one of its alternate names, sequential art. And when I hear sequential art, when I think sequential art, I think about math. I think about sequences, and I think about math as a result. I think about the sequences, I think about the pattern, I think about structure, and all that is present in comics. And here's the thing, right? There's a lot of math in storytelling in general, and pacing, and all that good stuff. And when it comes to comics, I feel like there's a lot to pull in. It's a complicated, nuanced medium, right? Not only are you telling a story, but you're telling a story, and there are visuals involved. There's plot involved, right? Like and bringing that all together, there's logistics involved, and there's math in all of it. Like when you tell that story, like you might be telling it for an issue, you might be telling it for a certain amount of issues, and there's math in how all that is structured. And not only do you have a certain amount of issues and a certain amount of pages per issues, but you have a certain number of panels per page, and you can play around with the panels. You can play around with everything within those panels, right? Because right, you can divide the panel a certain way to get certain visual effects, and there's math in all that and how it works. There's math in like how the characters are drawn, how the proportions work in that world, and if you're trying to get a certain tone for that world and a certain flow going on with the particular story, there's a lot of math in getting that to work. There's just so much going on in comics, and when I think about that, right, there's so many offshoots from comics, like going into different mediums. And the focus here, like graphic novels, books, or regular novels, if you prefer, and adaptations like film, video game, and TV. Um, so there's so many cool things to consider. Like, so give me a second because there was something that I wanted to process in my mind. Okay, we're good. So when I think comics, and I told you a little bit how math is involved and like just like the basic process in making a comic. Like there's math and behind like the editors, like math behind the company as a whole, and there's so many different mediums to reach, and each of those mediums has math associated with them. But if we want to focus on a graphic novel, like the one that's most similar to comics and how they're structured, it is a longer form comic, and a lot of the times it'll be like something that's one off or something that's an alternate tale, and whoever's making it has an idea of what they want to do with that story, right? They have like a certain amount of pages they want to like deal with, and the story they want to get across, and there's a lot of math that goes on with that, both the writing and the drawing, and just like plotting it all out in general. And in some cases, you might get a storyline in a comic that was like big and is like several issues, and maybe it was collected and kind of treated so that you can treat it more like a graphic novel. And there's a lot of math in how it goes and how it all functions. And then like for a novel, like I mean, there are several books that are like based off of comics. Um, there was an X-Men book series that I read growing up. Um, God, I forgot the exact name, but I'm pretty sure like at least one of the books was named like Chaos Engine, and that was awesome. So it was like a three-part series, and I'm pretty sure there was like reality warping in it, and it was crazy. But the whole thing is like, so now this was just text-based, right? But the whole like math being in a story is still a big thing, right? Because here, like, it was 3 books, so they wanted to tell the story in 3 books, and each of those books had a certain amount of pages and a certain amount of chapters within that book, and everything was divided up for some reason or another. And there's a lot of math in how that's divvied up, and how the story is told across those three books, and how everything flows. Right? There's a lot of math in that pacing, and that goes for regular books in addition to comics. So they didn't necessarily have to worry about drawing an image and this and that, but they have to consider the size and the font of their book, how big their book is going to be, and they do have to worry about like the cover for each of the stories. And there's a lot of math and how all that is drawn and how everything is typed up and how it all comes together and the process of like making a book in general. And that's interesting to me. And then there's adaptations. It just gets kind of crazy from there because like each adaptation can be talked about separately if you really want to get into it, right? Because it's going to be different than like when you're making a TV show or a film or a video game. So let's say you're looking at the current like landscape and movies. You get a lot of comic book movies, right? And a lot of them are adapting actual storylines or like adapting and combining storylines, and so they have an idea of the story that they want to tell, but they might want to restrict some things. If you're talking about something like the MCU, for instance, right? They have all these phases. They have a story that they want to tell. And want to spread out, and they have to decide what they want to do with these roughly 2-hour movies. And there's so much math that goes into just telling a story, but there's also math and the filming process itself and how it goes and how actors act and how people direct and how it all comes together in the budget. There's math in all of it. And then like if you're dealing with something with TV, you might actually have more time to do things like what they're currently doing with the Disney Plus shows. Right? You can split things up more. You can have something like WandaVision where you have a certain amount of episodes, each with varying time in this case, but with each episode there's an intentional amount of time given to this or that, and then they're using that to set up a bunch of other things in the process while telling, in this case, I think a pretty interesting story. And that's fascinating, right? Because there's a lot of math that goes into timing and everything. And then there's like like the What If, where each episode is pretty self-contained, and they're putting a tweak on something that may have happened, and that varies from episode to episode how they deal with that. And I think it's very interesting because they have a story that they want to tell, like, and the idea is to make it complete in that very short amount of time. Like, take the second one, where like, what if T'Challa became Star-Lord? By the way, very, very good episode. Just straight up legendary. And in that episode, they balanced the action, the drama, and the humor, and they also had to tell the story in a certain amount of time, right? They had to tell a story in that like half an hour time about, and there's a lot of math that goes into divvying up how each part of the story is going to go. There's also math that goes into the animation, and these things have to be done well in advance. Like, What If is still going on right now at the time of the recording, but a lot of things were filmed in advance. In any case, What If is pretty good, and that one was very, very fun. And by the way, Chadwick killed it in that episode. His last performance, and he gave it his all. Absolutely incredible. I recommend What If in general, but especially that episode. Good stuff. And so then all that, and there might be something that you might want to do different for a video game. Like now you get like a lot of movie adaptations, and there's some decisions you got to make with that. But I think one of the things that I'm thinking about right now is like there was this game that came out like in mid 2000s, like X-Men Next Dimension, where they don't adapt like the X-Men movies that are coming out at the time, believe it or not. Although there's games out there with that. What they did was they adapt certain storylines, and it was an interesting game. It was a fighting game, and there's a lot of math behind that, right? There's a lot of math in the mechanics and how the fighting worked in that particular game. There's a lot of math in the story that they wanted to tell, and I think that's all interesting. Side note, if you haven't played, it's a pretty decent game. Not the best, but pretty decent. and very, very interesting. And I find it fascinating that they went the route that they did, because they could have done it on, the movies that were coming out at the time, or like the X-Men TV show. But it was like kind of a deep cut, because like some of the characters and some of the things that happened, you'd probably only know like if you read the comics, or if you like looked up some stuff online, and that was like before like Wikipedia was really big, so kind of hard to do. But so it's like you look at who it was for. It's like it's for some pretty hardcore comic fans out there, or just really hardcore X Men fans, I guess. But either way, it's interesting how you make that decision, right? Because what you choose to adapt is also key. Because if you notice, like some of the comic book movies, like you'll notice that they tend to pick really well-known storylines, things that have been proven to be successful, and they put their tweaks on it, and kind of apply their formula to it. Like, because there's a lot of things that show up in the MCU that have had inspirations from the comics, but they put their MCU formula, or sorry, they put things into their MCU formula, MCU formula, and kind of roll with it from there. And so I think all of that is pretty interesting. And sometimes all this works well, sometimes it doesn't. But either way, well, there's a lot of math in everything. And there's a lot of math in comics. And all the topics that I talked about in this video is fundamentally bonkers, but I'm here for it. I'll see you in the next video. Professor Prime out.